let's crack into it. I'd like to welcome Managing Director for Field Flood Research Australia, Nick Poole. We've been challenged this year with disease management. It hasn't been easy, and it's been something that farmers have been contacting the BCG about, particularly over the last 2 months. And so, Nick, we've asked to come today and sort of talk to us about disease management, where we're at, how we can be managing our decisions through pretty tricky seasons like this one. So thank you, Nick.
Many thanks for the kind invitation to speak to you this morning. Although, of course, when I get an invitation to the Mallee and you're only renowned for being able to talk on disease, the dreaded D word, then you realise that actually there's something different happening. And so just driving through the Mallee, I can see what's different. I think it's fair to say that this last probably 2-3 years, certainly with us in the higher rainfall zone, which is where we carry out most of our work, it's been my great privilege to lead a project called the Hyper Yielding Crops Project. And we've seen within that project yields that we have never previously encountered. Over 12 tonne, admittedly, in large-scale plots, over 12 tonne on the mainland. Things that I never thought in my 20 years history working in Australia that I would see. Within that, we've also had evidence that our disease management programs in those really good yield potential years have been actually achieving yield advances that actually would have been the total yield of the crop back in 04, 05, 06 when I started. So 3 and 4 tonnes a hectare coming from purely keeping that crop disease free. And you might say, well, as a Mallee or a Wimmera grower, what on earth has that got to do with me? Because we know we can't necessarily get 12 tonne, but there's a huge connection. And that is that traditionally you sit on the best fungicide that's out there. It's called dry weather. And that fungicide serves you faithfully until you get the seasons which actually have the yield potential and you join the world of water from the world of dry. And the world of water, very interested in having exchanges of visits between growers in the different zones. And the first comment normally from the lower rainfall areas coming to the high rainfall zone is, gee, you must be like growing babies down here. Really easy. But actually, to achieve the yield potentials that that water gives you requires a different approach to looking after your crops. And today, in perhaps the session out in the paddock, we can run into some of this in more detail. But in essence, we talk about the yield gap. And the yield gap, very often in lower and medium rainfall zones, are where your yield potential is lifted, but your recognition of the disease management that goes with that doesn't match it. And so it's in these years of higher yield potential that there are some things that we can take on board from those higher rainfall zones. And this season is a classic. I've been driving, looking at some of the crops and thinking I had a flashback. And rather like Tim's recollections of 1992, mine don't go back that far, but they go back to '03 when I saw the eastern states crops go yellow. And they went yellow with yellow rust or stripe rust, whichever you want to call it. The basic principles haven't changed since then. It's just that perhaps with these higher yield potential seasons, these are the seasons where we really can start to make a difference in terms of the bottom line. And I want for just a moment to actually look at those basics. I made one of these earlier. And you'll have heard me talk many, many times, but looking at crops right now, it needs to be reiterated. Here's our wheat stem. It's not yet produced its head, it's heavily in boot. In essence, all we have to do to maximise and optimise our economics from this crop in these high yield potential seasons is to keep those top 3 solar panels, or as we've referred to them over the years, the money leaves. All we have to do is to make sure that they're protected. 10 years ago, you couldn't stop people putting flutriafol on their MAP. Why? Because what it does is it lasts just long enough to probably protect the 2 lower of those money leaves, what we refer to as F-2 and F-1, and then if the season was running well, to top off with a flag leaf spray. But if you grow a portfolio of varieties that are susceptible, and in fairness, we've had some heads up that this was coming. And we don't want to run with an upfront fungicide, and we want to continue growing those varieties, then we have to recognise that when that leaf emerges from the main stem, we need to be actively keeping it clean. Because unfortunately, although in the last 20 years you've got much, much better access to the best fungicide chemistry in the world, it's still chemistry that is better applied protectively than curatively or as a reaction to. So think about when you sprayed your crops this year, what looks good out there, what doesn't look so good, because it will revolve, I promise you, around those 3 solar panels. If this top solar panel, or the flag leaf, becomes infected, then you know that you have left those first fungicide decisions far too long, assuming you hadn't any flutriafol at the base of that crop. And it's really not much different with barley. And if you want to keep a susceptible variety clean of disease, it's as simple as saying, I need to make sure it's protected. When this leaf comes out, it grows stage 31 to 32, and when this one comes out, the flag leaf, at grow stage 39. The gap between those 2 fungicides not to exceed for, at a stretch, 5 weeks. But what happens, and it's happening all across Australia, is that people haven't used flutriafol. They've been going through with their broadleaf herbicide when these leaves are coming out, F-5. Now I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, where are they going to be when you're filling your grain? But the fungicide gets put in with them nonetheless. And then we say, yeah, no, we're all done. We're done with fungicide. Only this year it's a better season. It's wetter. And we grow this leaf, we grow this leaf, we grow this leaf. And then finally it's flag leaf. Do you know what? I think I might go again. But remember, all of those leaves have been blowing in the wind because you went so early on with the broadleaf that there's now actually no protection in place on the first of those important solar panels. And so it's like the announcement on the London Underground. Mind the gap. Mind the gap. And it's very applicable to using foliar fungicides to protect your money leaves. So it's fascinating at the moment to see what's actually happening with striped rust. It keeps coming back to the fact that we need good genetic resistance in our varieties. But if we don't have it, we have to take action to protect those money leaves. And I literally have been taking tens of calls in a week from agronomists, advisors, growers themselves, anxious, quite rightly, about protecting what seems to be higher yield potential. And one of the questions that's out there at the moment is, do I need to apply a third head wash spray? And I won't talk about it in detail at this stage, but one of the things to consider is what kind of infection levels have you got underneath that head as it comes out. But I'll take you back to 03, and I was a very nervous Tom, still am when I'm in front of a large group. One of the things that I very quickly encountered was a statement that says you cannot control striped rust in the head. That's not true. Therefore, if you are thinking of spraying a head wash spray, bear in mind it has two really important elements to it. First, it puts fungicide on the head as it comes out, once it's fully emerged, not once it's finished flowering. Because if it's finished flowering, that infection will have already set up. So, to get control of striped rust in the head, you need to protect the head before it goes into widespread flowering. The second is that last fungicide you put on has the impact of protecting the flag leaf again from further infection. And that, traditionally, is why it's used in the high rainfall zone, not in the lower rainfall regions. Because usually, heat or dry weather services to make that lengthened flag leaf existence, it nullifies it. So in other words, you don't normally need that spray, but we've had so many calls about people talking about controlling striped rust in the head, it's important to put out there when the fungicide will best work for you. I think that goes with one other point, which I think is really, really important. And I touched on it earlier. The fungicides that we have, even with these very, super duper SDHIs and QOIs or strobilurins as we commonly get to talk about them, those materials still are essentially protectants. So let me go back to the prop. When a leaf emerges, in the period just after it's emerged is the best time to engage a fungicide to give control and protection of that leaf. What's often forgotten is that when you spray leaves down here, the fungicide has no ability to go back down the leaf if it's been sprayed on, and then to move within the stem up to these newer leaves. If you've applied flutriafol from the base, from the roots, it does. But of course, by the time you get to the money leaves, it's starting to dissipate. So what it really is important to recognise is that with the materials that we commonly use, they cannot retrospectively go back down to the base of the leaf, go into the stem, and then protect the next leaf up. And that's why it's a confusing message on occasions that we have to treat disease early, but actually it's early in the disease cycle on the leaves we wish to protect. And it is the money leaves that secure you your greatest return when it actually comes to making money from disease management. So it's absolutely fantastic to see the mallee in such good shape with regards to that yield potential. Welcome to the world of water, and it's richly deserved because you've had some tough years in the 20 years that I look back on. But when you have that potential, that higher potential, and you're growing materials that you know is questionable, you have to protect the money leaves. And I wish BCG, I've only had the pleasure of coming to this area, and it is the only area in Australia where I never stay in a motel. I'm always looked after by somebody in the community. And that does credit to you as a group and a community. And I'd just like to wish you another 30 years like Tim. It won't be me here in 30 years' time, but I'd like to think that this group can go from strength to strength. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, and I think this is a great opportunity to ask Nick. I think there's a couple of roving mics. James has got one here, and Jenna's got one at the back. Barry, you've got a question?
We'll just let Simon go first.
Oh, sorry. Oh, you go first, Barry, and then up the front to Simon.
Yes, thanks, Nick. My question, how important is it to use the expensive herbicides at this stage to pick those money leaves, or can it get away with the cheaper versions? Do the same job.
I think the expensive versions, are materials that I would definitely use if I've got a really good yield potential set up in my crop. And by good yield potential, I'm meaning those, 4-ton crops, 4-ton plus perhaps. And I think that it's important though still to recognise that those good mixtures are still probably best as protectants. So if you've completely lost the situation, and I have to say sadly there are some crops that I've seen where they took me back to H45 and yellow paddocks, I think one could probably say then that you're wanting the most robust rates of those DMI materials, such as epoxyconazole, that actually you're needing the fire brigade at that stage. You haven't got much green leaf left there to retain, if that makes sense. But where you've got good potential and you've perhaps got a slightly earlier intervention, perhaps it might have been a later sowing, then I would consider those more expensive products, particularly if you've not yet got to head emergence. So depends what destruction the disease has already done in response to how much you will get the benefit of that newer chemistry, which still is essentially protecting. Does that answer your question?
2 seconds, Barry, we'll just get the microphone to you again.
Again, I'm saying, if you've been proactive, you've used chlorothalonil on the fertiliser, the crop looks really good, lots of potential, and you've been proactive. Just want to protect that last bit.
Yep.
Can't see very little disease in the crop.
Yep.
Maybe you look harder if you can.
Yep.
Do we have to keep going with expensive up to that point?
If you use flutriafol and the crop is clean at this stage, but you've got good yield potential and you're now coming up to consider what will be your only foliar fungicide, then I would definitely consider, with the amount of pressure that you've got within the district, I would consider the better chemistry.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay, Nick. Couple of questions. One is adult plant resistance, and particularly those non-susceptible plants in the rotation. How much emphasis do we put on that, and what sort of temperature drivers do we work on? Because in North, there are a lot of paddocks that are probably head movements and flowering now. They have flag on spray. There's a lot of talk about head wash, and you do see the presence of rust in the area. Is it something that we can actually confidence back into that genetic breed, and at what stage would you feel comfortable that would be trustworthy? And I guess the other one is Septoria, and throw that in for a bit of discussion on that, because that seems to be around 2, coming up to the top 2 leagues.
This gentleman's always wanting more for his money. Excellent questions nonetheless. Simon, I think first and foremost, if adult plant resistance hasn't kicked in by head emergence, then it's my understanding that it's never going to kick in. I think the other aspect is that when you look at what job you've done with those earlier sprays to protect it, leading up to this final scenario, the thing that is most important is to recognise that you've got no infection coming from below. So if that's done a really good job, then you're down to saying how much am I going to lose to head infection in adult plant resistance. And I personally would say that when you have good adult plant resistance and you've kept the foliage clean, the amount that you can gain back, particularly in hotter, drier environments that could change very quickly, is very small. So one of the things that we were doing back in 2003 was we were waiting for adult plant resistance to kick in and not paying due attention to the money leaves becoming infected, or not necessarily showing infection, but actually getting a lot of necrotic striping, which just robbed us of the green leaf area that we were hoping we didn't need to use a fungicide to protect. So there's part of me that thinks that the warmer environments, the hotter environments, we're going to get less back from those head sprays if we properly controlled the foliar levels of disease. You're still going to get some movement of spores between crops in the region, but I'm a firm believer that keeping the foliage clean is the way to actually more and more depend on that adult plant resistance. So I think if you've done something already and it's done a good job and you've not got active rust, then I think it's very marginal whether you start charging around with head wash sprays. Septoria, and I know Harry here is going to speak on this later, and so he'll have chapter and verse on it. But there's just one thing to remember with that disease. One thing. It's got a very long latent period. And you say, so what does that mean? Go back to this. And this happens in Europe, it happens in New Zealand, it happens all over the world where they have Septoria triticide. And most of the time, remember that excellent fungicide you have? Dry weather, it's not a problem. But if between that first spray timing at growth stage 31, 32, first, second node in the main stem, when that leaf is coming out, if between there and the top solar panel coming out, the flag, is wet, look out. Because small amounts of Septoria in the base have the ability to effectively splash those spores onto these leaves. Okay, so how does that relate to long latent period? Long latent period means that these leaves, as you come up to flag leaf, look clean. Because two of those leaves can emerge in the time taken for Septoria to land on the leaf and then express itself. So growers instinctively look at their crop, it looks clean. There's some Septoria perhaps on the tip of F-2, and they're saying, I don't think we've got a problem. If it's been wet, and you've got Septoria in the base of the crop, not one lesion here and then walk to the entrance to the marquee and find another one, that's not Septoria. You need Septoria on those plants, and it needs to be easily found. In those scenarios, just remember this long latent period, because what happens, and it happens in Europe all the time, is growers come along and they say, crop looks good, I'll leave it until head, and then I'll leave you with the average. Mind the gap. Mind the gap. Because the two top leaves will go rotten with Septoria because you haven't protected them.
Any other questions? I think what caught people off guard this year was that it came, going back to strike loss, it came in so early. So we were seeing it before growth stage 32, and so what's the strategy? You don't spray then, you still wait to protect those money leaves, or what do you do? Because that's, I think, what caught people off guard.
I'd answer that in two ways. Firstly, to say, if you protect your crop before growth stage 31, 32, it's not going to be as valuable in terms of economic return because the leaves that it protects aren't as important to you. But when you look at what you're faced with in the paddock at the moment, ask yourself, if you sprayed early, when did you then next take action? And that's where people, I think, have been caught out, is that there was a very early spray put in with the broadleaf and the feeling that we were covered. There's a lot of pressure coming from the north. What's then generally happened is that people have gone all the way through to flagleaf. And remember, these foliar fungicides don't work by moving out of those leaves and going through and protecting the newer leaves. And so we come back to, if you start early, unfortunately, you have to keep going. So every 3 to 4 weeks, you will be needing to reappraise. You can't go 6, 7, in some cases 8 weeks to flagleaf and expect that you will get control. And that's where people have been caught out. And one last thing, 20 years ago, we weren't talking about fungicide resistance. Now we are. And one of the things we all have to do is to think responsibly about how many fungicides we use and when we can best get our money back on those investments. And sometimes that's not always just, I'm going through I'll put it in. Think about how they work and what you're protecting. And those 3 key leaves, if you keep those 3 key leaves clean, which you can with a 2-spray stem elongation program, you won't go far wrong.
Have we seen any resistance?
Not in
Yeah.
rut. There's a small amount of evidence in stripe rust of changes, but it's not significant enough to affect the performance of our fungicides at this stage. But in diseases like Septoria that Simon brought up, very much is something we have to be mindful that that pathogen is already adapting to the fungicides we use. And one of the key things we can obviously do is move to more genetically resistant varieties, but if we can't do that, we need to minimise the number of hits that we make with fungicides. Hence my comment, if you start early, you will use more fungicides in a good season. And the other aspect is we need to consider rotations of those active ingredients and modes of action we use.
I've got a microphone here, but
Oh, it's coming. 2 seconds.
Nick, what's your thoughts on powdery mildew? So, in terms of if you go north of here, well, it's around here, but definitely you go north of here, it's become probably a bigger issue in the last few years as well. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Firstly, we're interested in any of you who've got powdery mildew. We have got some funding for a project where we're looking at powdery control, and we'd love to have knowledge of where we can find samples to see if our fungicides are still working in your region. That's the first thing. The second is wherever you go, anywhere in the world, materials that we're currently using aren't the materials that can be reliably used for the powdery mildew control. That's the first thing. In other words, the fungicides you have at your disposal currently are not good mildewicides. On top of that, unfortunately, we know that the powdery mildew population in Australia, the wheat powdery mildew population and barley is changing. And it means that the level of control you can expect from fungicides will be much lower. In work we did at Cacamatite in northeast Victoria last year, 50% control of the disease was actually regarded as a reasonable level of control. Good news is hopefully there can be some resistant varieties in the next couple of years that will help us out. The second is that hopefully there might be some more registrations for specific mildewicides. But thirdly, if I had powdery mildew and stripe rust 1-for-1, or stripe rust or powdery mildew and leaf rust 1-for-1, I know which one I'd rather be faced with in terms of how much yield it will rob. In other words, I don't say it's unimportant because it's not, but it's less important than those rust diseases that can come in late and really rob you of a lot of yield. Powdery is in your face. It's a very obvious disease that we clearly don't want, but unfortunately we haven't as yet got the armoury to control it. And elsewhere in the world they do have, but think this one through. Whenever you go with powdery mildew as a target, you have to consider a specific fungicide that's going to be added to your main recipe. That means your costs of control really go up. So we need to be absolutely sure that we're going to get our money back on specific mildewicides.
Nick, at Cacamatite, where you have 50% control,
Sorry,
what
Chief, and we're going to make this the last comment.
At Calamite, where you got 50% control of powdery mildew, what was the yield response?
The maximum yield response we had was just over, from memory, about just over a tonne to the hectare, but we couldn't get our levels of powdery mildew to correlate, the levels that we had control to correlate to yield. In fact, we used some azoxystrobin or Amastar to give it its brand name. That had only given us 45% control of powdery mildew, but it had given us better control of stripe rust and septoria, and that did correlate to yield. So, a little bit of doom and gloom, but also a little bit of hope in there as well.
Thanks, Nick. We might leave the session there, so thank you very much, Nick, if we can have a round of applause.